I'd like you to think of something for a moment, if you don't mind. I'd like you to think of an example of a time when Jesus healed someone. I'll give you a moment. You might think of any number of people, the cripples, the mute, the deaf, the demon-possessed who came to Jesus, and Jesus healed them. And you know what all those people who came to Jesus for healing all had in common? They couldn't heal themselves. They were all hurting, just as you sometimes are. For any number of different reasons, we find ourselves hurting, and hurting in ways that we can't easily fix or can't at all fix on our own. But Jesus healed. Our Jesus is a Jesus who heals. Another question I want you to think about for a moment. It's going to sound very similar, but I'm using the words of Psalm 30 here, so that's why I'm asking it. Think of an example of a time when Jesus helped someone. I'll give you a moment. You can actually use the same answer that you used for the first one. But you can use some other answers too. He helped the disciples, for example. He helped them all find a path through life they didn't even know that they were missing. He helped people who were sad in the face of death not be sad anymore by raising their loved ones from the dead. He helped Peter not drown. Yeah, he helped any number of people. You may have thought of some other good ones. And you know what all those people that Jesus helped had in common? They were helpless to help themselves. They needed help, and Jesus helped. When Jesus healed, when Jesus helped, he did all the work, he did all the heavy lifting. There's an example in the Bible of a time when Jesus did both those things for one person. Not the only example, but the one I'm thinking of at the moment. It was a man who was hanging on a cross next to the cross that Jesus was on. And he was hurting in many of the same ways that Jesus was. He was hanging on a cross after all. And he wasn't able to get himself out of that position. He needed help. Initially, he thought he needed help coming down from the cross, and so he demanded that Jesus would do that for him. At least early on he did. But in a mocking way. He wasn't really genuinely asking for help. He was making fun of Jesus. But then something changed. Maybe it was the reality sinking in that cross was going to be his deathbed. And there was something that changed in his perception about Jesus too, maybe the way that he handled his own pain and his own hurt, that he handled it with kindness yet and grace. He heard Jesus beg God to forgive those who were hurting him, and that was very unusual. And maybe it sunk in that if God might forgive the people who did awful things to Jesus, then maybe God would have room in his heart to forgive even him, that thief thought. And so at one point he turned to Jesus and he asked Jesus for help. He said, "Would you remember me when you go into your kingdom?" And then Jesus did what Jesus does. He helped. He promised him that today you will be with me in paradise, which meant that in just a few moments, that thief, he wasn't going to be hurting. He wasn't going to be in need of help. He was going to be completely healed and enjoying paradise and perfection. And you know what that thief had to do in order to make that happen. Same thing the blind man needed to do in order to not be blind anymore. The same thing that the demon-possessed needed to do in order to not be possessed by demons. Nothing. Jesus is the one who healed. Jesus is the one who helped. Jesus always does all the heavy lifting. All of it. And one day, because Jesus hung on that cross, you will find yourself in the same position that that thief was in, although I'm sure he doesn't call himself a thief in heaven. He probably calls himself blessed. Because he's in a place where he's no longer hurting and no longer in need of healing, and one day you will be there, but until you are, if at any point over the course of the rest of your life you find yourself feeling helpless, or you find yourself hurting, or in need of healing, just remember that our Jesus heals. Our Jesus helps. That's what David reminded himself of in Psalm 30. When he praises God, he says, God, when I cried out to you for help, you healed me, just as he does for you. Rest well tonight, my friends.